Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, it's 2 o'clock in London, so please be welcome to WFD, Westminster Foundation for Democracy. We are delighted to have you with us today, right before holidays for many of you, right before parliamentary recess. So thank you very much for having chosen to be with us for the launch of this piece of research. Please note that the session will be recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel. And you can all comment and using Twitter with our hashtag #OurPlanetNeedsDemocracy. So as some of you may remember, the first findings of this report were presented at our conference on environmental democracy back in March, and now we have the finalized product. This study explored the potential for development cooperation to help address climate change and environmental degradation through a greater focus on governance. Donor countries are investing on democracy support, and they are also investing more and more on supporting climate action. So greater investment will surely make a massive difference, but can we expect climate action at the scale and the pace that is needed from democracies if we do not address the governance weaknesses that are also holding it back? Well, this question obliged us as a democracy support organization to understand whether we can help address this nexus in our democracy support programming. As a system of government, democracy is vulnerable to glitches. It can be weakened by corruption, by policy capture, by exclusion, by polarization, and by short-termism. So these glitches, of course, affect its capacity to deliver across the policy spectrum. It's not just climate change or the environment. So we need to find ways to help democracies overcome these weaknesses, to help fix the governance and the politics failures behind climate inaction and deliver climate action through democratic means. So if we can achieve that, we will help democracy deliver for people and planet. Naturally, this approach is not a panacea. Whether, when, and how it may work is very context specific. So we know that we need to start with a robust political economy analysis to assess the potential for this approach to deliver impact and how the interventions should be designed. But we will have a chance to discuss all this later. So I'm delighted to welcome our three panelists. Lord Ian Duncan, the Deputy Speaker of the House of Lords, will briefly set the scene. Then Dr. Alina Averchenkova, a Distinguished Policy Fellow and Lead of the Governance and Legislation area at the Grantham Institute on Climate Change and the Environment, and Alicia Forsyth, who is the Head of the Climate Strategy and Coordination Department at the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. So without further ado, I'm most honored to give the floor to Lord Ian Duncan, the Deputy Speaker of the House of Lords. Lord Duncan was Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy from July 2019 to February 2020. He was also Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. And if we go back a little bit further, he was also the coordinator on climate and energy issues at his political group at the European Parliament, when he was serving as an MEP. So, Lord Duncan, I understand that you will need to leave us shortly, but thank you very much for joining us today to provide the opening remarks. Lord Duncan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Raphael. And again, thank you to the Westminster Foundation for Democracy. This is an exciting and an interesting report. I've given some thought how best to open the discussion. And I think I'm drawn to a quotation from Churchill, as people often are. Democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others that have been tried from time to time. And it's a reminder that democracy itself is a key ingredient, not the only ingredient, but the key ingredient in ensuring we can have serious climate action. So the question, I suppose, is what is a democracy and how does it work? And I was sketching out what I thought were the important elements. The demos itself, the people must be well informed. So there must be a media, a free media, which is able to communicate information in an impartial way. And the people receiving information must be able to understand it. So there must be a degree of education and appreciation, which allows them to make decisions based upon consideration. They must also be independent of action. They must be able to act as they see fit, not because they're beholden to a particular cause or a particular party or a particular hold over them. And ultimately, that is also connected to, let's call it a freedom from corruption, because it's perhaps not a surprise that when you look at the corruption index, those nations which are deemed to be most corrupt are also those in which climate degradation is almost hand in glove. So the challenge, I think, as we go forward, is looking at the world today. Now, as I said, democracy itself is not the sole ingredient of climate action. If it were, we would see the situation in Germany looking quite different. Of course, in Germany, we have a very advanced democracy with all the right ingredients, and yet they are currently considering what one might consider one of the most retrograde steps imaginable, returning to a coal-fired world. But they're doing so because they have made decisions, informed decisions. Whether they are popular decisions amongst the wider population remains to be tested in an election. But as we look at how we would use aid and how aid needs to be spread, the challenge of any organization which would wish to spend money is making sure the money is spent well, is spent efficiently, and ultimately delivers the objectives which are in mind. And in this regard, the UK government has been remarkably attentive to the criteria by which money can be spent wisely. And it's that wisdom itself that is actually resting, more often than not, upon the very elements of an informed demos, a democratic institutional democracy that are so key. Because in truth, money has been given by many Western countries over the years, quite often in the early days, given for one might consider quite selfish reasons. There were links to trade, which were perhaps not as hands-off as they might have appeared at the time. And quite often those recipient nations became beholden to technology or to individuals to provide ongoing relationships, which themselves were a tie, and perhaps not the best way of doing what the aid was designed to do. Where we are now, however, as we look at perhaps the greatest challenge of all, is in the area of climate change. And I think perhaps this week, this day, this moment in the United Kingdom, more than any other, we're living through the reality of what climate change could look like. And we are ill prepared for it, frankly. Anyone who's trying to travel across the United Kingdom today is going to struggle because we are not a country designed for 40 degrees centigrade temperatures. But looking at how money might be spent more wisely, there are many examples now of where the UK government and its overseas development aid has been instrumental in bringing about change. It has been at its most successful in nations where there has been a strong core of democracy. But at the same time, the test is not the commitment, it is the delivery. It is not the pledge, it is the practice. And this is where, when we seek to invest in any of these areas, we must judge very carefully against what people declare they will do and what they ultimately do. And so the test for any aid spent is the outcome itself. And of course, it isn't always easy to secure the outcome in quick time, certainly not by the time the money itself has been exhausted. So when we look then at whether we can secure the buy-in from the wider population who have to make these difficult decisions, on a very basic level, quite often individuals act in what one might consider self-interest, and that's not uncommon in any part of the world. The test is when they're able to set aside self-interest in the interest of either a larger community or a wider nation, or indeed a global cause. And as we see now, particularly around some of the aspects of biodiversity, in areas where we see forestry being sacrificed for what might well be considered to be short-term gain or short-term monetary benefit, but actually the global sacrifice is far too great to be contemplated. So the question is, how can our money be wisely spent amongst people who are themselves potentially in the short term actually going to not benefit from how this will work? And this comes back to the heart of the report. You need to ensure that the people themselves are within a functioning democracy, ideally a parliamentary democracy, but I'm a bit biased because I live in one, but there are other models of democracy. The reality remains that the individuals themselves, as I set out at the beginning, must be well informed. And the politicians must be free to act in the interests of those who sent them into the parliament in the first instance. And we must therefore have a low corruption factor in any corruption index. That will be, again, key. Because where you want the real discussions to take place is inside a parliament or a wider community discussion, to ensure then that all of the aspects can be aired and ultimately reported well by a free media. Because again, if the media itself is not free, the reporting itself will be biased, and bias leads to corruption, and corruption leads to the problem we've witnessed in the past. This report then begins to help us understand the links and the ingredients required to ensure that money, when it is spent by a developed nation into an area which is seeking to develop, is done so in the way in which it can achieve maximum benefit to all, both the donor nation and to the recipient nation. We in the UK have seen challenges as people begin to believe that the ODA is a sacrificial element, that it can be removed at any particular point for different political purposes at home. The reality is, of course, it's core and fundamental, not just to the wider recipient but also to ourselves, because we all benefit from the good work which is done by these funds, funds spent wisely, funds spent carefully, and funds spent toward the cause which we believe in, and in this instance, perhaps climate change being the greatest cause of all. So I don't want to go on for too much longer, except to say two things in conclusion. Democracy is never done. It is always ongoing. And the reality we have to face is what we believe to be a good and sound democracy can fail because of the ingredients being corrupted. And we must make sure, therefore, that it is a constant consideration of whether the democracy is doing what it's meant to be doing. So we cannot just simply say there is a parliament, therefore it is a good parliament, therefore it is good, doing good things. And the final point is, again, when it comes to spending money in a nation, in a planet which has been so ravaged by COVID, where there is less money, with all of the tensions which we are witnessing in a globally challenged environment with warfare in the continent of Europe, there has to be, of course, money spent in such a way that it is seen to be spent wisely, not just by those who receive it, but by those who donate it. Because without that, the risk is, of course, that that money then stops being donated. But the report itself is worth reading. The ideas behind it, informing it, are valid and vital. And at the heart of all of this is democracy. And I can think of no better thing to end on than saying democracy must prevail. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lord Duncan, for this passionate contribution. Please do stay as long as you can as we move on to the extra presentation. So please let me give the floor to Dr. Alina Averchenkova, who's been the lead author of this material. And Alina has been a distinguished policy fellow at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment since April 2013. And she's responsible for the engagement with policy and decision makers worldwide and research on international climate change policy. So we thought we'll be in very safe hands working with her. So Alina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Raphael, and hello, everyone. Lord Duncan, thank you for giving this excellent context for what I'm going to talk about. Effectively, if we look at the issue of climate change and many other environmental crises that we're facing currently, I think it's fair to say that climate crisis essentially is governance and politics failure. Because for many years, actually since late 80s, I would say science was very clear on the urgency to act. We have had Rio conventions adopted. However, politics has lagged behind. And the reasons for that are also pretty well known. There is a lack of political will in many parts of the world, short-term approach to policy making, often informed by electoral cycles. And there is also weak accountability for implementation. So arguably, to address climate change and environmental crisis, what we need is to find solutions that trigger the socio-political and institutional change first and most of all. And as Lord Duncan has alluded to, democracy and democratization has been seen as a key solution to that pretty much since early 90s. So in this report, what we set out to do in collaboration with Westminster Foundation for Democracy and with their support is to undertake research firstly to understand what academic evidence do we have that investigates the relationship between democracy and the key pillars of democracy and our ability to address climate and environmental crisis. And secondly, to understand to what extent development cooperation has addressed or should be able to address governance, democratization, climate and environment agendas together. And we've done so through interviews with 20 development cooperation professionals. Many of them come from the UK foreign aid community, being based in different parts of the world, but also experts from other organizations working in European countries, but also in the United States. So in the next 15 minutes, I'm going to share some of the key messages, but for more details, please feel free to consult our report. So the relationship between democracy and environment. What does current academic research tell us? Well, having looked at quite a lot of studies, there is actually a divide in the academic community on the general question whether democratization always would lead to better environmental outcomes. There are studies that emphasize that democracies actually come in different forms. They differ in their political setup. There are also different level of corruption, different level of civil participation, flow of information. And therefore, when we talk about answering that question, we need to keep that context in mind. Compatible features of democracy, some of which Lord Duncan has already alluded to, are a relatively higher value placed on human life than in other political systems, and also value placed on quality of life. Responsiveness of governance system of democracies to societal concerns that are raised by citizens and voters, higher level of accountability through legislature, judicial system, and other ways of democratic accountability, a power diffusion that is not concentrated in a way that it is in autocracies, and electors' ability to influence politics and policies, and therefore push for environmental concerns to come high on the environmental agenda. But what many studies emphasize is that it's not the democracy itself, but the deliberative aspect of democracy that allows for contestation, for political discussion in parliament, or civil society, that leads to the implementation of more legitimate and more ambitious environmental policies. And what is important to note also, many studies, in particular in the current context with the rising risk of social backlash, emphasize that it is important not avoid designing ambitious environmental policies without using democratic institutions and citizens' engagement. If we look at the critiques of the democracy, some studies argue that competing interests and values may diminish the level of ambition of environmental policies because you have to look for compromise, and that electoral cycles would lead to short-termism. In similar ways, great emphasis on individual interests and values may also go contrary to environmental policies. However, these studies don't take into account oftentimes the fact that autocracies, which oftentimes the example of China is cited, being an autocracy, China has been quite ambitious in its environmental policy, but that is based on the assumption that the autocratic state puts high value on environmental concerns, which is not always the case. So where we came out on balance in the literature review, that there is definitely a growing conception in the academic community of the synergy in the relationship between the key pillars of democracy and the environment. And I'm going to talk in more detail about that. So the key pillars of democracy, which often labeled as environmental democracy approach in relation to environment and climate crisis, are manifested in the core environmental rights, which have been set out in the Principle 10 of the Rio Convention already in 1992. And those are the right to access to environmental information, the right of public participation in decision-making, and access to justice on environmental matters. And to ensure that those rights are implemented, there are key building blocks such as a variety of political parties, environmental coalitions of NGOs and other political actors, strong judicial and legislative oversight, credible and open information on the environment, and freedom of political voice. So here is the summary of some of the key interventions that we have picked up from the studies that have been effective in driving both effective environmental outcomes, but also strengthening democracy. And these are enhancing ability of legislatures and judiciaries to tackle climate change and environmental issues and to provide stronger oversight, strengthening coalitions of NGOs specifically to address environmental problems, and that could include raising awareness of citizens on these issues. Also, making sure that political voices are more inclusive, that there are grassroots organizations that are part of the climate debate. Youth has, of course, been at the center of a lot of policy change on climate and environment around the world. And strengthening political parties in the way that they have their own ability to credibly assess the issue of climate change and environment and develop their position, rather than simply citing evidence provided to them by competing interests. So the report looks at many examples, practical examples of successful interventions and projects that are emerging around the world, including in the context of development cooperation. But one example I wanted to mention is the rapid growth of deliberative democracy approaches, such as climate assemblies, in particular in Europe. We have seen these assemblies emerging at the national level, but also at the regional and local levels all throughout Europe. There is now one being planned in Canada. There was one in the United States. And the approach here is that the Citizens' Assembly selects randomly selected citizens, which represent the demographic of the country. And those citizens are then brought together to deliberate on the issue related to climate policy. And what is very interesting, these assemblies, all of them have been more ambitious in many of their recommendations than what politicians thought was possible to be accepted by the public. Now, talking about environmental democracy approach, specifically in the context of development cooperation and foreign aid, as Raphael set out in his opening remarks, unfortunately, so far, we often see that the programs that support climate change and the environment and those that support democracy and governance don't necessarily overlap together, and they're not designed in a holistic way. But what we have seen through the conversations with the development aid community is that there is growing recognition of the importance of that integration. And I'm putting here some quotes for you so you can read them, but a good one is from Jenny Olsen, State Secretary for International Cooperation of Sweden, who spoke at Environmental Democracy Conference in March. And the remarks clearly recognize the linkages between human rights, backsliding of democracy, and the need to address climate change, therefore the need for a holistic approach. What is also interesting, a very strong message which came up through the conversation, is that climate change can actually be a very important entry point to act against the kind of backlash and backsliding of democracies that we're seeing around the world. Because this is seen as a safe issue oftentimes by the governments, and therefore strengthening key democratic pillars, which I talked about in terms of information, public participation, accountability, through focusing on climate change rather than coming in and saying, let's work on strengthening the democracy, oftentimes is a better way to structure cooperation while allowing to reach similar outcomes. And so here are examples of development professionals in Southeast Asia commenting exactly on that. And also Rosario Tucci from USAID saying that's exactly what they're saying, that climate change brings a powerful positive agenda through which one can actually galvanize citizens' participation and broader political process. However, why are we then not seeing the integration at scale? And that was part of the large part of the conversations that we've had with experts. And a number of barriers surfaced, and I've grouped them in those three buckets. So one group relates to knowledge and framing. What we're noticing, and that was in particular voiced by UK development community, but also other colleagues could relate to that as well, coming from other donor countries, is that there is oftentimes no programmatic integration. One notable exception is Sweden, which already for 5 years has integrated objectives of democracy, human rights, climate change, and the environment in their strategies. And also the framing of the strategic objectives oftentimes is based very much on emission reductions, on more tangible outcomes, rather than on more longer term governance change. The second challenge is funding cycles and strategies tend to be short term, while governance changes and shifting key pillars of democracy actually requires intervention over multiple years. And that is definitely limiting the ability of country teams in the embassies, in the country offices to implement programs that will target governance failures at scale. And finally, barriers related to measurement and reporting. The indicators oftentimes are based on, again, greenhouse gas emission reductions, quantifiable, easy indicators, which are very important. However, measuring governance change requires different sets of metrics, and there is some good work being done on that. And that is one of the recommendations, which I will come to in a minute, is that definitely more attention needs to be paid to how we measure and report on those projects. So just again, to share some of the quotes in the words of the experts. So again, the first one from Latin America, that funding systems, the challenge we face is that the way funding systems work and the way the political systems work, they don't lend themselves to investing in the kind of long-term project required. So the short-termism that I've talked about. And from Africa, similarly, governance issues take longer to address. So it is important to structure the programs, funding, development cooperation programs that go beyond one political cycle. There is also a lot of voices drawing the attention to the fact that we oftentimes still work in silos. Environmental specialists, governance specialists, they sit on different programs, and there is a need for more holistic approach and greater integration. However, there are clear opportunities to address these challenges, and you know, some obvious recommendations which came out of the studies that we need to ensure that programs are structured over long term, or at least obviously there are also limitations, political limitations of how long the funding programs could be. At least the theory of change should be structured over long term. And this is something a lot of, for example, embassies I've talked to are already doing in their programming when they try to integrate climate and governance agenda together. Secondly, we need to get more interdisciplinary, and there is a need for strategic leadership through programming from headquarters, but at the same time, there are also some good initiatives that colleagues mentioned in terms of specific practical solutions on how to ensure great integration and collaboration. For example, having dedicated governance, environmental governance leads who can actually bring together necessary expertise, bridging across thematic teams working on governments or climate separately. And for example, Sweden is doing that very successfully. I already talked about measurement. We need different metrics and very important political engagement. That was a particularly strong message among the UK development cooperation community. There was a feeling that the merger of DFID and Foreign Service into FCDO offers an excellent opportunity, and colleagues are already seeing this happening more, to actually bring the diplomatic and political engagement stronger into environmental governance programs, which would give a really good impulse to colleagues. So to conclude, here are some of the specific recommendations. Some of them I already mentioned in terms of improving the understanding of the importance of bridging climate change, environment, and governance agenda and the senior leadership, and integrating it into the objectives of development cooperation strategy. There is very valuable experience gathered in the country offices and embassies, and many colleagues I've spoken to felt that there would be great value in gathering that experience systematically, including on the impacts and also learnings on best practice on how those projects and programs have worked so far. Developing indicators, and very importantly, funding multidisciplinary pilot programs. We just need to also try it out at scale and see what works best in terms of bridging democracy assistance and environmental assistance together. And collaboration with philanthropic funders in this program, in this context, would be also very useful. And the report also provides specific ideas for interventions that can be funded. We can come to that in the discussion, but we also have an annex to the report which lists already plenty of examples from different parts of the world done with different development cooperation partners that actually show how the pillars of environmental democracy can be helpful in driving change. So I will conclude here just to say that I think from our research, it is very clear that unless we find an effective way to bring governance, politics, climate change, and environment together, including for a development cooperation program, I think it's going to be very difficult to address the crisis that we're facing. And we definitely have very good basis to build upon. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Alina. Just to mention that the full paper is available on our website, and my colleague has shared the link to the full paper, the summary for policymakers, and the web version. You see it in the chat box. So moving on to our final panelist, I'm delighted to welcome Alicia Forsyth. Alicia is the head of Climate Strategy and Coordination Department, ensuring that the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office plays a full role supporting the UK climate objectives. After all, the integrated review from last year placed climate change as the top foreign policy priority of the UK. So this has included overseeing and coordinating the diplomatic campaign around successful delivery of COP26. So Alicia, thank you very much for accepting our invitation to this launch, and we look forward to your comments. Alicia, the floor is yours.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Raphael. Good afternoon. My name is Alicia Forsyth, and I am the head of Climate Strategy and Coordination in the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. I really welcome the opportunity to be here today. I've been a long-standing fan of the Westminster Foundation for Democracy, and I really want to thank Alina and the team for the report published today. I think this represents a really important new thinking on the issues of environmental democracy. We agreed that I would not go through the report line by line, but rather talk about why this issue is so important, building on what Lord Duncan has already said so eloquently, but also speak to some of the issues raised by the report about how we are looking to take a more integrated and cross-cutting approach to climate in our diplomacy and our development, recognising that there is always further to go. I'm conscious that I'm speaking on a day in which UK temperature records have been broken, with all the transport disruption, the talk of threat to life that involves. I'm also conscious that this is a harbinger of what more is to come. The IPCC has spoken repeatedly of the scale of climate change challenge facing us both now and in the coming decades. This is an issue that will be a challenge to governments and societies across the world. Climatic instability driven by greenhouse gases does and will drive increasingly extreme weather events with impacts on prosperity and economic development, human displacement and migration. Ecosystem breakdowns, whether it be forests, oceans, soil erosion, water systems, will impact communities and livelihoods across the globe, with impacts on food security, and in the most fragile parts of the world, it has the potential to exacerbate pre-existing security tensions. All of this is going to represent huge challenges for governments and societies across the world, as do the solutions indeed. How do we invest in climate adaptation, be it flood defences or irrigation? How do we take the action to reorientate our economies to net zero? All of these issues are going to require a whole of society approach, and this is very much emphasised within COP26. Obviously, the private sector plays a role, and there was a lot of work done on this in COP26, led by Mark Honey and Nigel Topping. But we need to think about how this can be an inclusive agenda that involves all of society, including those groups that are so often marginalised, women and girls, Indigenous people, youth voices. All of this was reflected in the Glasgow Climate Pact, but what we now need to do is look at how this then translates into national contexts. How do these existential challenges translate into political discourse and government policy? And how will people get the information and the empowerment they need to participate in these debates? I really welcome the report today, which represents a huge step forward in thinking about what we can practically and feasibly do. It is good way for food for thought as we think about UK programming going forward. As I hope you know, the UK has committed to doubling its international climate finance to £11.6 billion. We've also committed to align all bilateral overseas development assistance with the Paris Agreement in 2023. Climate change is becoming a major part of our approach to development, as reflected in the International Development Strategy published earlier this year. And as reflected at COP26, we are moving to a more integrated approach about how we are thinking about tackling climate change. How do we bring together tackling emissions, climate adaptation, nature, so that we can no longer be thinking in silos. Likewise, in our development approach, we need to be thinking about how climate can and will be a cross-cutting part of our programming. The merged departments of the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office offers opportunities in the space, as the report reflects, bringing together our political and programming levers. Looking to the barriers identified in the report, we are thinking about how in this newish department, we continue to build climate expertise, consolidating on the huge push from last year. Some of this obviously will be technical specialist expertise in our overseas network, but we also need to be driving broader awareness and upskilling so that all FCDO officials, regardless of background and specialism, can engage with this agenda and integrate it into their work. The International Development Strategy talks about patience and partnerships, and we need to think about longer term partnerships that are going to help and sustain meaningful change in the countries involved. Elsewhere, obviously, I can point to the joint energy transition partnerships in South Africa, but what does something similar to this look like in the government space? As I promised, I'm not going to go through the report line by line. I'm deeply conscious of time, but I really want to thank the team for giving us such rich and delicious food for thought. It's great to have this event today, but I really hope that we can follow this up with smaller and more bespoke sessions with the FCDO network so that we can think about how we integrate this into our work going forward. In the meantime, I'd like to say thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Alicia. We certainly will take you up on that invitation for bespoke plotting and socialization. In principle, the channel for questions is open, and I see that we have 59 people connected. Maybe some question will be coming from the floor any second. But in the meantime, I may take the lead then. So I would ask you, Alicia, are there any additional research or analytical tools that you believe that would be helpful for FCDO and for donors more broadly to help in ensuring this broader application and mainstreaming of environmental democracy and governance approaches in climate support?
So I think if I was considering it, I mean, you've touched on it already within the report. Obviously, this issue about measurement and effectiveness, Lord Duncan's comments about making sure that we spend our money wisely are ringing in my ears as a good government official. So I think, if we can think about how do we measure effectiveness in this space, I think that's a really important part. As the report comments, as opposed to something where you can have, you can absolutely quantify, well, not absolutely quantify, but you can look at how are you reducing, greenhouse gas emissions, etc. What would work within the government space? How would we measure that? I think that probably is the space where we most be looking for assistance.
Yeah, well, that makes absolute sense. So, the message is taken, and we will certainly apply ourselves. I mean, the reality is that from the democracy support community, we already have a wealth of indicators on progress for this kind of programming. So we just need to find a way to integrate the environmental and climate component in the existing indicators for governance. but yeah, there's definitely a task that needs to be undertaken. I'm waiting to see if there are any other questions. Well, our audience is clearly, yes, I see one, yes. Well, I was afraid that our audience was melting or dehydrating, but I see that there are a couple of questions coming in. So the first question is for Alina. So you have emphasized that Sweden is a good example for environmental democracy. So could you please expand on why this is it? So are there any more specific learnings from the UK that could be drawn?
Thank you so much for the question. Sweden actually, why I emphasize them as a good example. I think Sweden quite early on, I think over 5 years ago, has taken an approach and a strategic decision that climate, environment, and democracy and human rights should be addressed together. And that was actually integrated into the strategy, overall strategy for the development cooperation. And one specific case study that we have looked at is Sweden's regional development cooperation with Asia and the Pacific region, which has then pioneered application of these approaches at the regional level. So what they've done is, just to give you a bit more specifics, they basically set at the strategic level that the development collaboration and cooperation should aim to strengthen the ability of regional actors to integrate environmental and climate perspective into programs related to human rights, democracy, and gender equality. And also to strengthen efforts to promote respect for human rights. Following this decision, they have also set up internally at the headquarter level at the Swedish International Development Agency. There are officers, technical officers, one I think with democracy background, another one is with climate and environment background, who work very closely together as a team, who supports all of the country teams to help them design the programs which bridge across those priorities. There have also been internal trainings for staff following the adoption of the strategy. And what is very interesting, the Asia Pacific region actually ran an assessment evaluation. Has that worked, this approach? And they surveyed 60 institutions, 60 partner institutions that have worked on the projects since the introduction of the strategy. What was interesting that 58 out of 60 institutions have said, local partners have said that they actually very much welcome the change in the approach because it has allowed them to work holistically on human rights, gender equality, environment, and climate change. And what is also interesting, a number of partners reported that prior to this change, they haven't necessarily internally recognized the interlinkages. And Sweden, as a donor, pushing them to think in that direction, has actually opened door to opportunities on designing more effective programs. So that is, I think, a very, very positive feedback and a lot to learn there, I think, from colleagues in Sweden for the UK as well, on how this change could be implemented. But perhaps to finish, what they've emphasized, colleagues at both the embassies, Swedish embassies that I've talked to, and also colleagues working in the headquarters, is that to really be effective, this kind of change requires more than just a strategy on paper. It does require training, engaging, and putting the support infrastructure internally to make sure embassies and country teams are actually equipped to follow through. Thank you.
Thank you, Alina. Well, we have a couple of questions more to either of you. Do any of the speakers know if there are any studies being done to study the impact of the climate change crisis on elections and electoral participation, especially in the context of displacement?
Perhaps I can start. I know that there have been some studies looking at to what extent political parties are picking up on the issue of climate change and integrating it in their manifestos. And in fact, one of my co-authors who is finishing a dissertation at the LSE is actually looking precisely at this issue at the moment. In the context of displacement, I haven't seen anything myself, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. But I think what has also been studied is the impact of climate change more broadly on public participation, which could also include getting more active in the elections, in particular on youth. But please feel free to drop me an email bilaterally, and yeah, I'll try to perhaps point you at least to some references on the political parties that might be of use. Thank you.
If we don't have any further comments from Alicia, we can move to another question that reads, as a development professional working closely on climate action in Southeast Asia, I can't lie and say that I never doubted the effectiveness of what I do in trying to tackle climate change. Can you share one or two concrete examples of how policy advocacy has been able to effect tangible change, be it in the short or the long term?
Shall I go for this, Rafa?
Yeah,
Alicia, please, you go ahead first, please. I didn't see you, Mike.
Yeah, and I saw there was a follow-up comment as well. I mean, obviously, we had the Paris Agreement, and that's been followed by the Glasgow Climate Pact. And what we were very concerned with within COP26 was thinking about how do we turn, what is agreements into action. How do we make sure that this actually translates into delivery? And that's very much a guiding principle within COP26. During that campaign, we've seen the world economy reorientate. So 30% of the world economy was covered by net zero pledges at the beginning. That now stands at 90%, but obviously we need to see the policies being enacted that allow countries to meet those commitments, and to meet those commitments not just through to 2050, but in looking through to 2030 and the action that needs to be taken this decade. I mean, we have seen, that sends very clear market signal. I talked about the work in the private sector and the reorientation of large amounts of private sector money so that it is more aligned with Paris Agreement and with net zero. I can talk about the Forest and Land Use Declaration and the action being taken to try and halt and preferably reverse deforestation. But obviously that needs to be then followed up in practice on the ground. I don't know whether that answers the question, but I think it reflects that, yes, absolutely, there's a recognition we now need to be moving towards the actions that we need to take and the reorientation we need to take to achieve those things that we've committed to doing.
Alina, you wanted to add something to this as well?
Yes, just on the question of one practical example, I'd like to just mention the UK's Climate Change Act. I think for me, that is, if I have to pick one example, which I think has been most impactful in terms of policy advocacy on the UK side internationally, I think that would be one. The example of UK's climate legislation over the past 10 years has inspired many countries around the world, both in developed and developing. A lot of countries have actually built on the key elements of the UK's Climate Change Act, and as a result, there is greater accountability in the climate governance systems in those countries with different levels of success, but nevertheless, and I think UK development cooperation has been central in spreading and building on that experience. So I'll just leave that example on the table.
Thank you, Alina. Well, you would know, I mean, as I said earlier, we were lucky to count on the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment because it has been at the forefront of knowledge production on climate governance for over a decade, and it has created fantastic open access tools like global databases on climate legislation and even climate litigation, which have become a staple for climate governance practitioners. So you've seen the trickle of UK-inspired legislation that has been percolating all these years, for the last 10 years, as you said. So yeah, absolutely, that's That's a very good point. Let's move on to a different question. Progress, and more often constraints to successful climate change and adaptation policy, is linked to the political economy and political settlement. If interests do not align, it is difficult to see how reforms, and especially their implementation, will be successful. How have you factored this into your report? What are your recommendations for approaches in the domain of environmental democracy?
Thank you so much, Egbert. Excellent question. I think that's where, first of all, the importance of deliberation comes in. I think what we're seeing, and that, for example, goes to the examples of citizens' assemblies. Usually you ensure that people who are drawn to the citizens' assembly, they represent a variety of views, including the different demographics backgrounds. And what we actually are seeing is that given the facts which the experts are provided to citizens, citizens coming with different perspectives, different political preferences, actually are able to deliberate and agree on the recommendations on how to move forward. And so far, actually, most of these recommendations have been quite ambitious. And so to me, Citizens' Assembly example is like a mini cosmos of what we're trying to do with the environmental democracy approach: provide credible and transparent information, make sure that citizens, excuse me, and key political actors are well informed, and create a space for deliberation so that interests can actually be debated and aligned, and where not possible, also expose vested interests, which might be misinforming the process. So, excuse me. So I think the key pillars of environmental democracy actually allow you to move closer to aligning those interests in a society. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Alina. Well, this one is clearly for Alicia. So Alicia mentioned that the FCDO merger offers significant opportunities for the integration of environmental and democracy support work. However, this merger has been controversial. So how optimistic is she that this integrated work can be a priority in the middle of significant institutional and political changes?
So I would say, what was I saying that? I mean, I would say, and you know, I lead an integrated department. I think the merger did help when, you know, during the COP26 campaign last year about how we could bring the leaders together. Looking ahead, again, you know, you can see how we can bring together, you know, the amazing diplomatic network we've got across the world, also with our, you know, 11.6 billion pounds of ICF, you know, to deliver on our international climate objectives. So I, you know, my personal experience is that it has been, you know, it is a for want of a better phrase, a force multiplier in terms of what we've been able to do.
Well, thank you very much. Well, there is still another question. Well, yes, Alina, by all means, do come back to your answer. Yeah.
Yes, I wanted to actually add something to the previous question on the recommendations on aligning interests, which may not be aligned. One other recommendation we make, and that actually came out from the empirical research conversations with practitioners, is that what is very helpful is that any intervention that is designed on climate and environment should actually be based on political economy analysis. So you actually need to understand as a first step, and that's one recommendation we make, is the first step. It's actually very important to understand what political economy you're dealing with, in particular thinking about climate policy, but also environment more broadly. So that is one practical takeaway as well from our analysis. And it's useful if that comes as a standard kind of recommendation for embassies and kind of program managers to consider, because many of them are doing it already anyway, but it's not uniform.
Thank you, Alina. And well, it seems we have come to the end of this event. So I would like to finish with a few quotes from the speakers. while noting certainly and thanking FCDO for the open invitation to continue this conversation. This report is also food for thought for us, because there are many findings as to things that we ought to be doing if we really want to continue doing this and rolling it out and integrating it into country programs. So we are looking forward to learning together with you. From Lord Duncan's intervention, I would keep this quote that democracy is a key ingredient in ensuring that we can have effective climate action. And as Alicia also underlined, that the test for the approach is not the commitment, but the delivery. So not the pledge, but the outcome. So the jury is still out. From Alicia's response, I note that it was acknowledged that climate change is becoming a major part of FCDO's approach to development, and this is going to require a whole of society approach. And well, Alina, you've given us a lot of food for thought, but if I have to pick one line, I would keep that statement that unless we find a way to bring effectively politics, governance, climate and the environment together, it is going to be very difficult to address the climate crisis. So once again, there are 50 people still connected. So thank you very much for having joined us. The recording will be available on YouTube, and please continue using the hashtag #OurPlanetNeedsDemocracy. Thank you very much for having joined us today. Have a great day.